Hi, we're going to shift gears a little bit. I'm not going to talk about rhino policies or anything. I'm not going to talk about 100 years of history or more either. I'm going to talk about the last 9 years of my life in 15 minutes, approximately, or at least part of it anyway. So as we've been hearing, heterogeneity is important and lots of things affect heterogeneity. HIP is a very patchy landscape with all these different vegetation types co-occurring. For the purpose of this talk, I'm talking about vegetation structure, and I split the plants into 4 different groups. So short lawn grasses, bunch grasses, shorter woody plants and taller woody plants. HIP is not just patchy on a large landscape scale, but also on a small scale. So within a few meters, you can see all of the examples of those vegetation structures occurring together. And I wanted to know how biotic agents influence that vegetation. So I focused on a few. The first one, ta-da! I don't need to say very much about them. They accept to point out that they are the highest density in HIP anywhere in the world, so it's a great place to study their impacts. And also they make up the biggest biomass of all the large herbivores. The next one, an invertebrate escaped the invertebrate room. Woohoo! They also have a really high biomass, so you might expect them to have a big effect. The biomass is estimated to be something similar to all of the large mammalian herbivores put together. And they're really widespread, and they've been described as ecosystem engineers all over the place, mostly for their soil working activities. So these were the 2 agents that I wanted to focus on. So I started on a small scale. There's a lot of actual comparisons between rhinos and termites. They operate over similar scales, quite small home ranges for rhinos, quite big areas affected by termites. I focused on 3 mound building species because mounds are quite easy to see when you're in the landscape. So on the top right there, it's Macrotermes mounds, and then next to that with a black circle, that's an Odontotermes mound. Below there is the little lump in the grass, that's Trinomitermes, and then that's currently standing next to a rhino midden. So these are all nutrient hotspots in the landscape. The termites and the rhinos go out, collect vegetation, bring them into these central hotspots, and create this nutrient-rich patch. And that's similar sizes, comparable sizes, and over similar timescales. So in the same way that successive generations of rhinos take over territories of previous generations, also termites will recolonize mounds left empty by colonies that have died off. So I wanted to know on the small scale, immediately surrounding these features, what is the impact on the vegetation structure? So what you can see here is on the y-axis, you can see the percentage of ground covered by those 4 different vegetation structures. And then on the x-axis, the 4 features, so the 3 termite mounds and the rhino midden. And then the white bar on the far left is immediately adjacent to each feature, and then each bar is going away until you get to the black bar, which is in the surrounding control savanna matrix. And what I want to point out is that all 4 of the features affect the vegetation. So here you can see that bunch grass is negatively affected by all 4 of those features. And they also differently affect vegetation types. So rhinos increase lawn grass around the midden, Macrotermes increase trees, Trinovitermes decrease shrubs. So what I want you to take away from this is that all 4 of those features affect vegetation structure. So having looked at a very small immediate scale, I wanted to scale up a bit and look across the landscape. So I mapped 10 1-by-1 kilometre blocks at a 50 by 50 metre grid cell size. So that tiny black square, I don't know if you can see it, is the original cell size. And within those things, I mapped the occurrence of those 4 vegetation types. So just to give you an example, this is the same block mapped 3 times for 3 of those vegetation types. So you can see it is really patchy on this small scale. So the blue is where there's not very much of that particular vegetation type, and the orange is where there's a lot. And I wanted to know, what is the relationship between this patchy vegetation and the features in the landscape? So I counted the presence in each of those 50 metre grid cells of these 3 termite mounds, the same termite mounds, And then I wanted to get an idea of how rhinos, large mammals, affect the area in long-term use. So I counted the presence of these infrastructure features in the landscape that I hope would give an indication of long-term use. Sorry about the table, but just what you'll see is on the left-hand side you see the 4 vegetation types, and then the numbers in the boxes are the F values, so that gives an indication of the strength of the relationship. And what I want to point out is that in all 4 of the vegetation types, but particularly here, macrotermes mounds had a much stronger relationship with the surrounding vegetation across the landscape than any of the large mammal features. You can see that there was a strong negative relationship with bunch grass, so where there's more macrotermes mounds, there's less bunch grass, and a strong positive relationship with lawn grass and with trees. Shrubs were slightly different. It's still a termite that has the biggest effect, so there was a negative relationship with trinervitermes mounds with shrubs, and the one kind of big result for large mammals was that the 250 metre scale, so that's an aggregation of those original 50 metre scales, and that was a negative impact as well. So what I hope you can see from this result and the previous one is that termites are having an impact on the vegetation structure in the landscape. So given that I counted mounds, I wanted to look at a possible mechanism as to how they're doing this. Obviously they consume a lot of vegetation, but it seems to be a lot centered around mounds. So what is it about the mounds? So let's just take a closer look for a moment. The macrotermes and odontothermes are both fungus-growing termites, so they farm fungi, and their mounds are quite complex structures created to make the right conditions for their fungi. Macrotermes build these big above-ground structures, and to make them stable and relatively predation-free, they get a lot of clay in there, so they're these big hard things. Odontothermes don't build such a big above-ground structure, so they still have clay because they still need to protect themselves, but not as much because they don't need the structural stability. Trinervitermes don't grow fungi, and they use their mounds merely as a barn, as a storage facility. And they build their mound differently as well. They build it from feces, so there's a lot of organic matter in those mounds. So the hypothesis for this section was, does the structure and function of the mound affect the nutrients in the soil? And then the nutrients in the soil, how does that affect the vegetation? So again, I was looking at the lawn and bunch grass combination. So you might expect, if there's a lot of nutrients, that the lawn grass may be able to come in and colonize more quickly than the bunch grass. So I tested with a greenhouse and a field experiment. So I smushed up the mounds and took the soil into the greenhouse, and then grew a very dominant bunch grass at the top and a dominant lawn grass at the bottom. And what you can see is in the trinerviterme soil, there was a really strong, significant effect, a lot more vegetation biomass in the trinerviterme soil than any of the other 3. If we look at the chemical properties, that's not really a big surprise. Like I said, there's a lot more organic matter, so a lot more nitrogen and phosphorus in those soils. So basically, you're growing the plants in fertilizer, they do really well. Brilliant. So now take those same soils and apply them in the field experiment. So I cut the grass, removed all the woody species to start at a sort of a 0 level, and then applied the different soils in these plots. Measured them over a period of 2 years to see whether we saw any change in vegetation. And we expected, you fertilize the soil, you expect more grass, more biomass, and a change to lawn grass perhaps in the trinerviterme soil. That's not what we found. What we found is that there was the biggest change in the macrotermes soil plots. And the second biggest change was in the dug up soil. Now this was soil that I took away from any termite mounds from 20 centimetres below the soil surface, so kind of a controlled soil application. If we go back and look again at this table of the chemical properties, the macroterme soil had the highest calcium and the second highest sodium, and the dug up soil had the highest sodium. So what we think was happening was that we basically created these salt licks in the environment. So in the patches where these nice micronutrients were, the large herbivores came in, preferentially grazed those areas, and you got more lawn grass occurring there. So it seems like the mound effect is an interaction between these termites and the large herbivores. So those are important interactions. You can't just say it's just rhinos, yours, on their own, yours. These interactions are really important. And it seems that both rhino are important because of their massive density in the landscape, but termites also have this really big density in the landscape. Rhinos can do it because they're really big, so they're largely predator-free for most of their life. Termites are quite small, but they live in these really well-protected colonies. So perhaps that's how come they manage to get these really large biomass in the environment. So future work, given that termites are important in structuring the landscape, and interactions between termites and large herbivores are also really important in structuring the landscape, maybe looking at the sort of landscape of fear for termites might be a good way to go in the future to see what's shaping these interactions and therefore vegetation patterns. Then lastly, a conservation note, I think termites might be a really good tool for restoration ecology. So if you can promote healthy termite populations, you create some of this vegetation heterogeneity to encourage different herbivore populations. So one way to do that, instead of burning your areas, would be to cut, slash, but not burn, and mulch so that you are improving conditions for termites. And yeah, I want to start a Save Our Termite program, encouraging farmers not to kill termites, poison, knock down the mounds, and you might get a much healthier landscape. Thank you.